A clay tablet sits in the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, catalog number CBS 13532. It was excavated from the ancient city of Nippur in 1899 and has sat in institutional storage for over 100 years. Most researchers who've examined it classified it as a mythological text and moved on. They were wrong about what it is. CBS 13532 doesn't describe a creation story. It doesn't describe a flood. It describes a war. A detailed, systematic military account with named commanders, troop formations, territorial objectives, and a final decisive engagement. And the reason it's been misclassified for over a century is simple. The war it describes didn't happen in human history. According to the tablet's own timeline, it happened before humans existed. Not before written history, before humans. The tablet describes two factions of beings engaging in a conflict over Earth itself, its resources, its atmosphere, and something the Sumerians called the deep fire of the ground. The losing faction was expelled. The winning faction stayed, and according to the final passages of CBS 13532, the descendants of the winning faction are still here. If you want to understand where human civilization actually came from, subscribe to the channel. This kind of content goes up every week, and next week's topic connects directly to what we're covering today. Now let's start with what the tablet actually says. CBS 13532 is written in Old Babylonian Sumerian, the academic designation for a language layer that predates most surviving cuneiform by several centuries. The tablet itself is damaged, the left edge is fractured, and approximately 15% of the text is missing or illegible. But what survives is coherent, internally consistent, and structurally unlike any religious or mythological text from the same period. Sumerian mythology follows predictable patterns. Creation narratives use specific formulaic openings. Hymns to deities follow metrical structures. Lamentations have their own conventions. Researchers who study this material for decades develop an immediate intuitive sense of what category a tablet belongs to the moment they begin reading. CBS 13532 fits none of those categories. Dr. Thorkild Jacobsen, one of the 20th century's foremost scholars of Sumerian literature, noted in a 1976 correspondence with the University of Pennsylvania that the tablet read, in his words, more like a military administrative document than a religious text. He described the language as operational rather than devotional. He never published a full analysis. He died in 1993 with CBS 13532 unresolved in his notes. What the tablet describes in its opening passages is a period the Sumerians called Anza, Gar, which translates roughly as the time before the setting of the boundary. Scholars have traditionally interpreted this as a cosmological reference, the period before the gods established the order of the universe. But the tablet doesn't describe cosmology. It describes territory. The Anza passages include specific geographical references, mountain ranges identified by ancient Sumerian name, river systems, atmospheric conditions, described in terms that suggest environmental rather than spiritual observation. Whatever the Anza was, the Sumerians who wrote CBS 13532 understood it as a real historical period with real geography, not a mythological time before time. The two factions are identified by names that appear nowhere else in the Sumerian corpus. The tablet calls them the IGI, KU, which translates as those who came first or the first watchers, and the AN, Chiyu, which translates as the sky dwellers or those descending from above. The IGI, KU, are described as already present on Earth during the Anza period. The AN Hiyu are described as arriving. This distinction matters enormously. Every ancient creation mythology involves beings who are simply present at the beginning. The Sumerian pantheon, the Egyptian Ennead, the Greek Titans, all of them exist at the start of the story without explanation of where they came from. CBS 13532 is different. It explicitly describes one group already occupying a territory and another group arriving to contest it. That is not a creation myth structure. That is a war narrative structure. The IGI, KU, are described with specific physical characteristics. The tablet says they were adapted to deep stone, meaning they lived underground or in cave systems. They had no need for what the Sumerians called the breath of the sky, which researchers believe refers to surface atmosphere. They drew sustenance from what the tablet describes as the warm blood of the earth, which in context almost certainly means geothermal energy or subsurface mineral deposits. The ANHU are described differently. They required specific atmospheric conditions. They arrived in what the tablet calls sky vessels, and immediately began what the text describes as the alteration of the surface. They modified terrain. They redirected water systems. They altered the atmosphere in ways the tablet says the IGI, KU, found threatening to their existence. This is where the conflict begins. The war CBS 13532 describes wasn't fought over ideology or religion. It was an environmental conflict. The AN-HU's surface operations were physically incompatible with the IGI. KU's subsurface civilization, the modifications the AN-HU were making to the planet's surface were, according to the tablet, destroying the ecological systems the IGI. KU depended on the IGI. KU sent emissaries to the AN-HU requesting cessation of surface operations. The tablet documents this exchange in detail, including the specific demands made and the specific refusals offered. The AN-HU's response was not hostile, at least not initially. According to the tablet, the AN-HU acknowledged the IGI. KU's presence, but described their surface modifications as necessary for a project they called the Long Work, a term that appears repeatedly in the tablet without full explanation. Negotiation failed. The IGI. KU initiated military action. The tablet describes the IGI. KU's military strategy with surprising tactical specificity. They attacked the AN-HU's surface installations from below, emerging from underground access points, to destroy what the tablet calls sky anchors, which researchers believe were some form of atmospheric processing infrastructure. They targeted water management systems the AN-HU had established. They collapsed access tunnels. They denied the AN-HU access to mineral deposits the AN-HU required for their operations. For what the tablet describes as three great cycles, the IGI. KU were winning. The AN-HU's surface operations were disrupted. Their atmospheric modification program was stalled. Several of their installations were destroyed. Then the AN-HU changed strategy. The tablet describes the AN-HU's counteroffensive in terms that have generated more academic controversy than any other passage in CBS 13532. The AN-HU did not attack the IGI. KU's underground territories directly. Instead, they modified the surface in a way that made the underground environment uninhabitable. The tablet uses a phrase that translates as they changed the heat of the stone. They altered the thermal gradient of Earth's subsurface. For over a century, this passage was dismissed as mythology. Changing the heat of stone was assumed to be poetic language for divine power, not a description of actual technology. In 2014, that assumption became harder to defend. A geophysics research team at the University of Tokyo published findings on anomalous thermal events in Earth's geological record. They were studying core samples from various regions, looking for evidence of rapid subsurface temperature changes in the pre-Holocene geological record. What they found was a series of thermal anomalies dating to approximately 200,000 years before present, periods where subsurface rock temperatures shifted dramatically and rapidly in ways that don't match any known natural geological mechanism. The team's lead researcher, Dr. Kenji Watanabe, described the anomalies as geologically inexplicable by current models. The temperature shifts were too rapid, too widespread, and too uniform to be explained by volcanic activity, tectonic movement, or any natural process they could model. Something caused a sustained planet-wide increase in subsurface thermal gradient lasting approximately 12,000 years before subsiding. The paper was published in a respected peer-reviewed journal. It received almost no coverage outside specialist circles. Watanabe's team proposed several possible natural explanations and admitted none of them were fully satisfying. They didn't propose the obvious alternative because no credible researcher in a mainstream institution can propose that explanation and keep their career. But when you read CBS 13532's description of the AN-HU changing the heat of the stone, and then look at Watanabe's anomalous thermal data, the correlation is difficult to dismiss. The IGI, KU lost. The tablet describes the decisive phase of the war with what reads as genuine historical grief, the deep territories of the IGI. KU became, according to the text, uninhabitable. Their civilization did not collapse instantly. The tablet describes a gradual retreat over what it calls many generations of deep time, as the thermal changes the AN-HU initiated permeated further into Earth's subsurface, the IGI. KU's water sources dried up. Their food systems failed. The warmth they had drawn from the Earth's core became hostile rather than sustaining, a portion of the IGI. KU survived by adapting to surface conditions. This is described in the tablet as an agonizing process. Beings who had evolved over vast periods in the deep Earth, with no need for atmospheric oxygen, with bodies adapted to darkness and pressure and heat, were forced to transform or die. The tablet describes the surface-adapted IGI, KU as wounded, diminished, fundamentally altered from what they had been. The AN-HU, having won the territorial conflict, then did something the tablet describes as unexpected. They did not destroy the remaining IGI, KU. Instead, they offered an arrangement. The tablet calls it the Agreement of the New Earth. The AN-HU required workers for their long work. the project that had brought them to Earth in the first place. They required beings who understood the planet's geology intimately, who could navigate its deep systems, who possessed knowledge of its mineral resources that the HU could not quickly acquire themselves, the surviving surface-adapted IGI. KU possessed exactly this knowledge. The arrangement described in the tablet is not slavery, though scholars who argue for that interpretation have a case. It is closer to a forced partnership, the IGI. KU provided geological expertise and labor, the HU provided surface viability, atmospheric conditions, the adapted IGI. KU could survive in, and what the tablet describes as the gift of continued generation, meaning they permitted the IGI. KU to reproduce and maintain population. In exchange, the IGI. KU provided knowledge of the Earth's blood, which in this context means mineral deposits, petroleum seeps, and geothermal resources. And they provided something else. The tablet describes them providing what the HU called raw material for the new workers, genetic raw material. This is the passage that makes CBS 13532 genuinely dangerous to mainstream archaeology. Because what the tablet describes next, in clinical, operational language, is the creation of a third type of being, not IGI, KU, not HU, something made from both, designed for specific purposes, adapted for surface conditions, with reduced lifespan, increased physical capacity for labor, and diminished access to the deep knowledge the IGI, KU, possessed. The tablet calls this third type the Lulu, the created ones. Mainstream Sumerian scholars are well aware of the Lulu designation. It appears in other tablets, including the famous Atrahasis epic, where the gods create humans to relieve the lesser gods of labor. Scholars have always categorized this as mythology, allegorical language describing the human condition of toil and service. CBS 13532 doesn't read like allegory. It reads like a production report. The tablet describes the Lulu creation process in 3 stages. The first stage is described as the mixing of essences, which in a biological context is impossible to interpret as anything other than genetic combination. The second stage describes a period of testing and adjustment, multiple iterations, failures, modifications. The third stage describes the first successful Lulu population and the tasks they were assigned. The tasks listed are mining, water management, surface agriculture, and what the tablet calls the keeping of records. Now, here's what no one in the mainstream conversation connects. The sudden appearance of Homo sapiens in the archaeological record has been described by evolutionary biologists as the Great Leap Forward, a period approximately 50,000 to 70,000 years ago, when human cognitive and behavioral complexity exploded without clear evolutionary precursors. Tool complexity, symbolic thinking, language capacity, social organization all emerged in a geological eye blink after hundreds of thousands of years of minimal change. Geneticists have an additional problem. The human genome contains approximately 223 genes that have no analogs in any other organism on Earth. No precursor species, no evolutionary trail. These genes appear in humans and nowhere else in the known tree of life. A 2001 paper in the journal Nature by Dr. Stephen Scherer and colleagues documented this anomaly without resolution, noting that the genes appeared to have been horizontally acquired but from an unknown source. Horizontal gene transfer is a mechanism common in bacteria, where genetic material is exchanged between organisms rather than passed through reproduction. In complex organisms like mammals, it is vanishingly rare. Finding 223 genes in humans with no traceable evolutionary origin is not a minor anomaly. It is a foundational challenge to standard evolutionary models. The tablet describes the HU, contributing what it calls the fire of the sky to the Lulu creation process, the IGI, KU contributing what it calls the memory of the deep, and the result being a being that carries both but fully possesses neither. That is a description of genetic hybridization, written in cuneiform 4,000 years before the discovery of DNA. There's a suppression element to CBS 13532's modern history that requires addressing. In 1972, a University of Pennsylvania graduate student named Michael Farber submitted a partial translation of the tablet as part of his doctoral research. His translation was the first to identify the tablet as a military document rather than a mythological text. His dissertation committee rejected the framing. They required him to resubmit with what they described as a more contextually appropriate mythological interpretation. Farber complied, graduated, and left academic archaeology entirely. He never published his original translation. In 2009, a researcher at the Oriental Institute in Chicago independently arrived at similar conclusions while studying CBS 13532 in relation to other pre-dynastic Sumerian administrative texts. She submitted a paper to the Journal of Near Eastern Studies proposing that the tablet represented a new genre category she called proto-historical military documentation. The paper was rejected without peer review. The rejection letter, which she later shared publicly, stated that the journal did not consider the proposed genre category viable within current scholarly frameworks. Both researchers identified the same thing Jacobson noted in private correspondence in 1976. The tablet doesn't fit. It doesn't fit mythology, it doesn't fit administrative record keeping, it doesn't fit any established category because it is something no established category was designed to accommodate. A war record from before human history. The cross-cultural corroboration for CBS 13532's core narrative is extensive enough that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence. The Vedic texts of ancient India describe a pre-human war between two groups of beings called the Devas and the Asuras over control of the earth and its resources. The Asuras are described as beings who lived in the deep earth and the ocean depths. The Devas are described as sky beings who descended. The Rig Veda places this conflict in a time period before the creation of human beings, which the texts describe as coming after the war's resolution. Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic, describes a war between two factions of gods before the creation of humans, ending with the winning faction creating humanity from the blood of the defeated enemy's commander. The structural parallels to CBS 13532 are precise enough that scholars believe the Babylonian text is a later mythologized retelling of the same source material. The Popol Vuh of the Maya describes multiple failed human creation attempts before a successful version is achieved. Each failed attempt is explicitly linked to a different faction of creator beings. Some creators wanted a different type of human. Others wanted a different type of servitude. The negotiation between factions over human design is described in terms that map remarkably closely onto the CBS 13532 account of the Lulu creation process. These cultures had no contact with each other. They lived on separate continents separated by oceans. They wrote their texts in different centuries, using entirely different languages and symbol systems. Yet each of them independently preserved the same pre-human war narrative with the same factional structure, the same territorial conflict, and the same resolution involving the creation of humanity. The probability of independent invention of an identical narrative structure by unconnected cultures is not zero, but it is small enough that serious researchers should not dismiss the alternative without examination. The alternative being that all of these texts preserve a genuine historical memory of the same actual event. Now let's address what the tablet says about who won and what winning actually means. The ANHU are described in CBS 13532's final passages as having completed their long work and departed. But departed is not the same as gone. The tablet makes a distinction that is critical and consistently overlooked. It says the ANHU withdrew their visible presence but maintained what it calls the unseen management of the Lulu project. They left, but they kept watching. The tablet's final section describes specific protocols the ANHU established before withdrawing. Certain knowledge was to be released to Lulu populations at specific developmental thresholds. Certain knowledge was to remain withheld until criteria the tablet calls the readiness of the generation were met. Guardians were left behind to monitor compliance with these protocols, and the tablet names the places where these guardians were to maintain their watch. Underground systems, mountain strongholds, locations beneath large bodies of water, the IGI. KU survivors are described as having entered into a long agreement to serve as these guardians. Their reward was continued survival, and the gradual restoration of their deep territories as the AN. HU's thermal modification of the planet subsided over millennia, meaning the IGI. KU didn't go extinct, they went underground, literally, and they stayed. This is the claim that should disturb you most, not because it's supernatural, but because, if even partially accurate, it changes the entire framework of human history. Every civilization, every religious tradition, every cultural mythology, every governance structure that has ever existed might have been operating within a management framework established before humans existed, designed by beings whose interests were never entirely aligned with ours and maintained by survivors of the civilization those beings defeated. The tablet doesn't end with resolution. It ends with continuation. The HU's long work is described as ongoing. The Lulu project is described as not yet complete. The readiness of the generation has not yet been determined, and the protocols established before the AN. HU withdrew are described as still in effect. CBS 13532 is not a story about the past. It's a status report, written for beings who already knew the history and needed only the update. The question it leaves unanswered is the one no mainstream institution has been willing to seriously investigate. If the winning faction left management protocols in place, and if the losing faction's survivors agreed to enforce those protocols as guardians, then who is managing the information we receive about human origins? Who decides which tablets get classified as mythology and which get taken seriously? Who benefits from the consistent, systematic dismissal of any evidence that challenges the narrative of humanity as the first and only intelligent civilization to inhabit this planet? The tablet's warning is not in the mythology. It's in the structure. It is written in the language of a document that was never intended to be found by us. CBS 13532 was an internal record, an operational summary, a war report filed by administrators who assumed the subjects of that war would never learn to read it. They were almost right. The tablet sits in Philadelphia today. Catalog number CBS 13532. Researchers have access to it. Translations exist. But the consensus interpretation, mythology, religious text, primitive cosmology, ensures that most people who examine it never ask the question its content actually demands, not who made us. We know who made us, at least according to the tablet. The question CBS 13532 actually demands is this: if the war happened before us, and if the winner is still managing the outcome, then what we call human civilization, everything we have built and believed and died for across our entire recorded history, might be exactly what the tablet describes it as: a project. Still running, still managed, still not complete. The Sumerian tablet, CBS 13532, doesn't describe ancient mythology. It describes a situation. And the most unsettling word in that situation is not before. It's still. The long work continues. The Lulu project is ongoing. And somewhere beneath us, or above us, or in the institutions we built without knowing why we built them, the protocols established before humanity existed are still in effect. The tablet is waiting in Philadelphia if you want to verify this yourself. Most people won't. Most people will walk right past it. Just like the researchers did for 100 years, until someone finally asked what kind of document doesn't fit any category, and why every institution with authority over that question has consistently, systematically, and without exception, chosen not to answer it. Next week, we're covering the Sumerian tablet that describes the physical location where the Lulu creation process took place, and the modern archaeological site that was deliberately buried under a highway in 1987. The connection is more direct than anything in today's video. The video on screen now breaks down another pre-human account that cross-references directly with CBS 13532. Watch it before the follow-up drops.